Jake Morrison had always been what you might politely call eccentric. Less polite people called him the guy who chirps at pigeons, but Jake preferred avian communications specialist, which was a fancy way of saying he spent most of his time at the Cascade Mountain Research Station making weird noises at birds and pretending they talked back. The thing is, Jake was pretty sure they actually did talk back. Not in English, obviously, he wasn't completely nuts, but after 12 years of studying migration patterns, breeding calls, and territorial disputes, Jake had developed what he called his universal bird vocabulary, a series of whistles, clicks, and warbles that seemed to get reactions from everything from chickadees to hawks. His colleagues thought he'd finally cracked. Dr. Emily Watson, the station director, had started leaving mental health pamphlets on his desk. Subtle. Real subtle, Emily. "Napoleon," Jake said to the large black crow perched on his windowsill, "tell me again why I chose to study the one branch of science where talking to your subjects makes people think you need therapy." Napoleon cocked his head and let out a series of sharp caws that Jake swore sounded judgmental. The crow had been hanging around the station for 3 months now, ever since Jake had shared his lunch with him. Napoleon was unusually intelligent, even for a crow, and had an attitude that would make a New York cab driver proud. "Yeah, well, easy for you to say," Jake muttered, turning back to his computer screen. "You don't have to write grant applications explaining why your research methodology includes extended conversations with test subjects." The morning news was playing in the background, something Jake usually ignored in favor of bird call recordings, but today, the anchor's voice had that special tone that meant something big was happening, the kind of big that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. "Breaking news this hour. Multiple world governments are confirming what can only be described as first contact with an extraterrestrial species. Sleek, metallic ships have appeared over major population centers worldwide, and preliminary communications have been established." Jake looked up from his computer. Outside his window, Napoleon was making a series of agitated clicks and caws, his feathers ruffled in a way Jake had never seen before. Other birds were gathering in the nearby trees. Lots of other birds. More than should be normal for this time of day. The news continued. "The alien delegation, led by what appears to be their chief ambassador, has requested formal diplomatic meetings with Earth's leadership. President Martinez is expected to make a statement within the hour." On screen, footage showed massive ships hovering silently above major cities. They looked like someone had taken a fighter jet, stretched it out and given it delusions of grandeur, sleek, silver, and radiating the kind of arrogance that suggested their owners thought they were pretty hot stuff. "Well, Napoleon," Jake said, watching as more birds gathered outside, their calls growing increasingly agitated. "Looks like we're about to find out if humans are as smart as they think they are. My money's on no." Napoleon let out what Jake could have sworn was a snort of agreement. Then the crow fixed him with one black eye and made a series of rapid, urgent calls that Jake had never heard before. Calls that made every other bird in the area go completely, unnaturally silent. And for the first time in 12 years of bird research, Jake Morrison felt genuinely worried about what his feathered friends were trying to tell him. The aliens, as it turned out, were exactly as charming as they looked, which was to say, not at all. Ambassador Krex stood 7 feet tall, had skin that looked like polished obsidian, and possessed the kind of natural arrogance that suggested he'd never met a mirror he didn't like. His second-in-command, Commander Vex, was shorter but somehow managed to look even more uptight, if that was possible. Together, they made Jake think of a cosmic HOA board that had gotten way too much power. The diplomatic meeting was being broadcast live, which Jake figured was either humanity's smartest move or its last one. He watched from his research station while Napoleon perched on his shoulder, both of them equally unimpressed by what they were seeing. "Greetings, primitive inhabitants of the third planet," Krex announced in perfect, condescending English. "I am Ambassador Krex of the Valdorian Empire. We have traveled across the void to offer you the honor of our presence." President Martinez, to her credit, managed to keep her poker face. "Welcome to Earth, Ambassador. We're pleased to meet you and hope this marks the beginning of peaceful relations between our species." Krex's laugh sounded like gravel in a blender. "Peaceful? How quaint. Tell me, flightless ones, what exactly do you think you have to offer beings such as ourselves? You cannot soar through your atmosphere, you lack proper talons for hunting, and your military technology is laughably primitive." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "Did this guy seriously just critique our species for not having wings and claws?" he muttered. Napoleon cawed in what sounded suspiciously like agreement. Commander Vex stepped forward, consulting what looked like a tablet made of liquid metal. Our scans indicate your species shows no significant evolutionary adaptations for predation. You are, essentially, omnivorous scavengers with delusions of apex status. Well, that's not insulting at all, Jake said. Outside his window, the bird situation was getting weirder. What had started as unusual gathering behavior was turning into something Jake had never seen in over a decade of fieldwork. Massive flocks were forming and moving in coordinated patterns across the sky. Ravens, hawks, eagles, even tiny songbirds were flying together in formations that defied every territorial instinct they should have had. On the broadcast, things weren't going much better. Krex was now openly mocking humanity's attempts at diplomacy. Your planet shows promise as a hunting preserve. The Valdorian Empire has need of new territories for recreational purposes. We are prepared to relocate your population to more suitable habitats. Reservations, I believe you call them. President Martinez's poker face finally cracked. I'm sorry, did you just suggest turning Earth into your personal hunting ground? Suggest? No. Krex's smile revealed teeth that belonged in a nightmare. We are informing you of our decision. Your species may continue to exist in designated areas while we utilize the remainder of your world for our purposes. This is quite generous, considering your obvious inability to properly defend your territory. Jake grabbed his binoculars and headed outside. The bird behavior was beyond unusual now. It was coordinated, purposeful, and spreading. He could see massive flights in the distance, all moving in the same general direction, toward the population centers, toward where the alien ships were stationed. He tried calling the local wildlife authority, then the state environmental office, then anyone who might listen to a report about unprecedented bird migration patterns. Each conversation went about the same way. Let me get this straight, Dr. Morrison. You think the birds are organizing some kind of response to the alien visitors? I'm saying their behavior suggests they're responding to a perceived threat in ways I've never documented before. And you came to this conclusion by talking to them? By observing their behavioral patterns and vocalizations, yes. Click. Dial tone. Repeat. Back on the broadcast, Krex was wrapping up humanity's death sentence with all the ceremony of someone ordering lunch. We shall return in what you call 72 hours for your formal surrender. Please have your leaders prepared to sign the territorial transfer documents. Oh, and do try not to resist. Valdorians do so enjoy a good hunt, but we prefer our prey to have at least a sporting chance. The transmission ended, leaving Earth's leadership looking like they'd just been told they had 3 days to live, which, Jake reflected, they probably had. Napoleon made a series of urgent, complex calls that Jake had been hearing variations of all day. This time, though, Jake thought he understood what his feathered friend was trying to tell him. You're trying to warn me, aren't you, buddy? You all are. The question is, warn me about what? Napoleon fixed him with one dark eye and let out a single sharp cry that somehow managed to sound like, "Figure it out, genius." Jake was starting to think maybe he should. Turns out, intercepting alien communications was a lot easier when the aliens thought you were too primitive to understand advanced technology. Jake had always been handy with electronics, a skill that came in surprisingly useful when you spent most of your time in remote research stations with temperamental equipment. The Valdorian ships were broadcasting on multiple frequencies, and their encryption was apparently designed to keep out other advanced civilizations, not curious humans with modified radio equipment and too much free time. Jake had been listening for 6 hours when he finally cracked their communication protocols. What he heard made his blood run cold. Phase 1 complete, Commander Vex. The primitives have accepted our territorial acquisition proposal. Excellent, Ambassador. Shall I begin Phase 2 preparations? Proceed. Initiate atmospheric sterilization protocols. I want this planet clean and ready for proper Valdorian habitation within 1 solar rotation. Jake nearly dropped his headphones. Sterilization protocols. They weren't planning to relocate humanity to reservations. They were planning to wipe out every living thing on the planet and start over. The hunting preserve story was quite clever, sir. Much easier than explaining our actual colonization requirements. Indeed, these creatures are remarkably gullible. They actually believe we intend to keep them alive for sport, as if Valdorians would lower themselves to hunt such pathetic prey. Jake's hands were shaking as he recorded everything. This was genocide on a planetary scale, and he was probably the only human who knew about it. He tried every emergency number he could think of: Pentagon, State Department, local FBI field office, even his congressman's office. The conversations were depressingly similar. Sir, I need to report an imminent threat to national security. What kind of threat? The aliens are lying about their intentions. They're planning to exterminate all life on Earth within 24 hours. And you know this how? I intercepted their communications. You, a bird researcher at a mountain station, intercepted classified alien military communications. Yes. Sir, are you currently under the care of a mental health professional? After the 15th hang-up, Jake realized nobody was going to believe him. He was the weird guy who talked to birds. Even with recordings, even with proof, he was just another crazy person claiming the government was covering up the truth. But the birds believed him. Napoleon had been growing more agitated with each failed phone call, and the gathering outside had turned into something that looked less like unusual migration and more like a military mobilization. If Jake didn't know better, he'd say they were waiting for orders. Which gave him a completely insane idea. Jake grabbed his field recordings, his most powerful speaker system, and headed outside. If his 12 years of avian communication research meant anything, if his universal bird vocabulary was more than just wishful thinking, then maybe he could do something no government official or military strategist could do. Maybe he could ask for help. He set up his equipment in the largest clearing near the research station, with Napoleon perched on his shoulder like some kind of feathered advisor. The sun was setting, painting the sky the color of blood, which seemed uncomfortably appropriate. Okay, buddy, Jake said to Napoleon. I'm about to attempt the most complex bird call sequence ever recorded. If I'm right, and you guys really can understand me, then I need you to spread the word to every bird on the planet. Think you can handle that? Napoleon let out a short, sharp call that Jake interpreted as, just get on with it already. Jake took a deep breath and began the most important conversation of his life. He started with the basic territorial warning call that most species recognized, then moved into distress signals, danger alerts, and finally into the complex pattern he'd been developing for over a decade. The sequence that he hoped, desperately hoped, meant help us. The response was immediate. Napoleon took flight, calling back in a pattern Jake had never heard before. Within seconds, other birds were answering from all directions. Ravens, hawks, songbirds, even waterfowl from the distant lake. The calls spread outward like ripples on a pond, growing louder and more complex with each passing minute. Overhead, one of the alien ships detected the unusual activity. A spotlight swept the clearing, illuminating Jake and his equipment. Through his intercepted communications, he heard Krexp's voice, dripping with amusement. Commander, are you observing the amusing display from Grid 77? Yes, Ambassador. One of the primitives appears to be making territorial noises at local fauna. Quite entertaining. Indeed. The creature seems to believe it can communicate with lower life forms. How delightfully pathetic. Continue monitoring for our amusement. Jake looked up at the ship's spotlight, then at Napoleon, who had returned to his shoulder and was fixing him with an expectant stare. Well, Jake said, his voice carrying across the clearing and into his transmitter. Let's see who's laughing when this is over. The bird calls were spreading faster now, carried by species that could fly hundreds of miles without stopping. Jake's message was going global, and if he was right about what he'd told them, humanity was about to get help from the most unexpected allies in Earth's history. Of course, if he was wrong, he was just a crazy guy making noise in the woods while his planet got ready to die. Time to find out which. What happened next was something that would be debated by ornithologists, military strategists, and philosophers for generations to come. Jake's call had reached exactly the right birds at exactly the right time, and those birds did something unprecedented in the history of interspecies cooperation. They organized. It started small. A murder of crows from the Cascade foothills took flight in perfect formation, their calls carrying Jake's message northward. A kettle of hawks picked up the signal and spread it east. Migrating geese, already in flight, changed course and began broadcasting the alert across 3 states simultaneously. Within 30 minutes, Jake's desperate plea had reached every major bird population on the North American continent. Within an hour, transoceanic migrants were carrying the message to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Arctic terns, those marathon flyers of the avian world, redirected from their polar routes to spread the word to populations that had never heard Jake Morrison's name, but understood his call perfectly. The response was immediate and terrifying in its scope. Above New York City, where Ambassador Krex's flagship hung like a metallic thundercloud, the first wave arrived at 9:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. A flock of common pigeons, those rats with wings that New Yorkers had been cursing for decades, rose from their roosts in unprecedented numbers. Not hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. Commander Vex was the first to notice. Ambassador, we're detecting unusual atmospheric disturbances above the primary metropolitan area. Define unusual, Commander. Multiple radar contacts, small fast-moving objects, approximately... Vex paused, his voice uncertain. Sir, I'm reading over 2 million individual targets approaching from all vectors. Krex laughed, that gravel in a blender's sound that had become humanity's least favorite alien characteristic. 2 million? Commander, your sensors are obviously malfunctioning. Nothing on this primitive world could coordinate such numbers. Sir, visual confirmation coming in now. The main view screen flickered to life, showing the night sky around Manhattan. At first, it looked like a strange, moving cloud formation. Then the pattern became clear, and Krex's laughter died in his throat. The sky was black with wings. Pigeons led the vanguard, but they weren't alone. Hawks dove in perfect formation alongside sparrows. Eagles soared wing to wing with tiny wrens. Seagulls abandoned their coastal territories to join ravens from the mountains. Even the infamous geese of Central Park, those territorial terrorists that had been traumatizing joggers for years, had enlisted in what could only be described as an aerial army. This is impossible, Vex whispered. These species are natural competitors. They don't cooperate. They can't cooperate. But they were cooperating. More than that, they were coordinating with a precision that would have impressed military strategists across the galaxy. The formation moved like a single organism, responding to calls and signals that traveled faster than the Valdorian computers could process. In London, a similar sight was developing above the Thames. Every pigeon, crow, and sparrow in the greater metropolitan area had taken flight simultaneously, their numbers blocking out the city lights. The London eye disappeared behind a curtain of feathers and fury. Tokyo's skies filled with an aerial ballet of crows, those intelligent urban survivors that had learned to drop nuts on busy streets and use traffic to crack them open. They brought friends, lots of friends. Paris found itself hosting what could only be described as the world's most ominous air show, as every bird from the Eiffel Tower to the outskirts of the city joined a coordinated flight pattern that defied every known law of avian behavior. Back in New York, Krex was no longer laughing. The Valdurian Empire had conquered 47 worlds across 12 star systems, but none of those victories had prepared them for what they were seeing now. Individual birds were landing on their ship's hull, not in the random pattern of confused animals, but in deliberate, organized groups. Sir! Vex's voice was climbing toward panic. They're not attacking yet. They're just positioning themselves. Positioning for what? I don't know, but they're covering every external sensor, every communication array, every... The ship lurched as 10,000 pigeons simultaneously landed on the port sensor array. The main navigation screen flickered and went dark. Warning lights began flashing across the command center, as bird after bird settled onto critical external components with what could only be described as tactical precision. Get them off! Krex roared. Use the defensive systems. Sir, our weapons are designed for ship-to-ship combat and ground bombardment. We can't target individual organisms smaller than... The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in, bathing the command center in an eerie red glow that made Krex's obsidian skin look like it was bleeding. External communications are down, sir. Navigation is compromised. And sir, Vex's voice cracked. They're doing this to all our ships, simultaneously, across the entire planet. Through the emergency lighting, Krex could see the viewports were completely covered with birds. Not swarming chaotically, but arranged in organized patterns. Each species taking specific positions like soldiers following battle plans. Occasionally, a crow would tap on the reinforced glass with its beak. 3 sharp raps that somehow sounded disturbingly like Morse code. How, Craigs whispered, how are primitive animals coordinating a planetary response? Miles away, at the Cascade Mountain Research Station, Jake Morrison was asking himself the same question. He stood in his clearing, watching wave after wave of birds pass overhead, all heading toward the major population centers where the alien ships waited. Napoleon remained on his shoulder, occasionally letting out calls that seemed to be directing traffic. I don't suppose you want to explain how you're managing this, Jake asked his feathered companion. Napoleon fixed him with one dark eye and made a sound that Jake could have sworn was a chuckle. Then the crow launched himself into the air, joining a formation of ravens that was heading south toward Los Angeles. Jake's radio crackled to life with intercepted Valdorian communications, and for the first time since this whole mess started, he heard something beautiful. Ambassador Krex was screaming. L-ships, emergency ascent. Get us out of this planet's atmosphere immediately. Sir, we can't achieve liftoff. The birds are interfering with engine intake systems. Then blast them off. Our weapon systems can't lock onto targets this small and numerous, sir. It's like trying to shoot individual raindrops in a thunderstorm. Jake grinned. Earth's birds had done something that the combined military might of humanity couldn't accomplish. They'd turned the aliens' technological superiority into a liability. All those advanced weapons, all that sophisticated equipment, and none of it was designed to deal with millions of small, fast, intelligent opponents who had spent millions of years perfecting the art of survival. The sky above every major city on Earth had gone dark with wings, and the universe's self-proclaimed apex predators were about to learn a very important lesson about underestimating the locals. Especially when the locals had friends. Lots and lots of angry, organized, surprisingly tactical friends. What followed was the most one-sided battle in galactic history, though calling it a battle was being generous to the Valdorans. It was more like watching a master class in applied ornithology, taught by very angry professors with beaks and talons. The attack began at exactly 10:15 p.m., coordinated across 12 time zones with a precision that would have made NATO weep with envy. Jake, monitoring the alien communications from his research station, heard the moment when Ambassador Krex realized that his hunters had become the hunted. All ships, we are under assault by indigenous life forms. Krex's voice cracked through Jake's speakers. Repeat, we are under attack by birds. Sir, request clarification. Did you say birds? Yes, Commander Vex, I said birds. Millions of them. They're everywhere. Above Manhattan, the Valdorian flagship was experiencing what military historians would later term rapid disassembly via coordinated pecking. The pigeons had been joined by an alliance that defied every known law of interspecies competition. Red-tailed hawks worked alongside common crows. Peregrine falcons, those speed demons of the sky, dive-bombed sensor arrays while house sparrows performed precision strikes on communication relays. But it was the seagulls that truly showed their tactical genius. These flying garbage disposals, hated by beachgoers everywhere, had finally found their calling. They attacked in waves, using their infamous persistence to overwhelm alien defensive systems. When one seagull got blasted away by an energy weapon, 3 more took its place. They were like feathered zombies, with an attitude problem, and no concept of retreat. Engine 1 is compromised, Vex reported, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of wings and alien profanity. Something has built a nest in the intake manifold. A nest? In 20 minutes? Sir, I believe it's a collaborative effort. I'm seeing construction materials being passed between multiple species in an assembly line formation. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. The birds weren't just attacking. They were actively sabotaging with the kind of engineering ingenuity that would have impressed a team of human mechanics. Crows, those notorious tool musers, were directing operations, while smaller birds carried materials, and larger raptors provided aerial cover. In London, things were going even worse for the Valdorians. British birds, apparently having learned passive-aggressive warfare from their human companions, had developed a strategy of overwhelming politeness. They lined up in orderly queues to take turns pecking at vital ship components, occasionally pausing to let other species cut in line, with what Jake swore looked like apologetic head bobs. London vessel reporting critical systems failure, came another panicked transmission. The local fauna appears to be taking turns. Taking turns doing what? Destroying our ships, sir, very politely. One group attacks while others wait patiently for their opportunity. It's deeply unsettling. But it was the Canadian geese that elevated the assault from impressive to legendary. These aerial sociopaths, the honey badgers of the bird world, had apparently decided that alien invasion fell under their jurisdiction as professional sky bullies. They arrived in V formations that looked suspiciously like military attack patterns, honking what could only be described as war cries. Toronto vessel under siege, the communication crackled. Local waterfowl have breached the hull. Repeat, geese have breached the hull. How is this possible? Jake's radio picked up the answer from his monitoring station. The geese weren't just pecking, they were problem-solving. Working in coordinated groups, they had figured out how to trigger emergency airlocks by landing on pressure plates simultaneously. Once inside, they proceeded to redecorate the ship interiors in a distinctly biological fashion. They're defecating on everything. Sir, the control panels, the navigation systems, the command chairs. It's like they're claiming territory. Clean it up. We tried, sir. Every time we clear one section, another group arrives and remarks it. Also, sir, the smell is affecting crew performance. Several officers have requested reassignment to less hostile environments, like active volcanic planets. Meanwhile, in Jake's clearing, Napoleon had returned with what appeared to be a full report. The crow perched on Jake's shoulder and delivered a series of calls that Jake was beginning to interpret as a tactical briefing. The message seemed to be, mission proceeding according to plan. Request permission to commence Phase 2. Phase 2? Jake asked. What's Phase 2? Napoleon's response was interrupted by a transmission from the Valdorian flagship that made Jake's blood run cold, then immediately warm with pride. This is Ambassador Krex to all vessels. We are implementing emergency withdrawal protocols. Repeat, all ships are to achieve immediate orbital escape velocity. Sir, we can't. Every ship is reporting the same problem. Engine systems compromised, navigation offline, communication arrays non-functional. And sir, they're not just disabling our ships. What do you mean? Sir, they're learning from each attack. The birds that hit our sister ship in Los Angeles use different tactics than the ones that hit us in New York. They're adapting, sharing information, improving their strategies in real time. Jake grinned. Of course they were. Birds weren't just intelligent, they were problem solvers, who had been adapting to survive in environments that ranged from Arctic tundra to urban jungles. They learned, they communicated, and most importantly, they remembered. Every Valdorian defensive measure was being analyzed, countered, and shared across a global network that put the internet to shame. The coup de grace came from an unexpected source: the flamingos. These pink, seemingly delicate wading birds had traveled thousands of miles from their tropical habitats to participate in what ornithologists would later call the Great Coordination. They arrived at the Florida-based Valdorian vessel in a formation so beautiful it looked choreographed, then proceeded to demonstrate that their elegant necks weren't just for show. Miami vessel reporting. Sir, I don't know how to report this. Just tell me, Commander. The flamingos, sir. They're using their necks like grappling hooks. They've formed chains, connecting themselves between our ship and the ground. We can't achieve liftoff without dragging half Florida with us. Cut the engines. Emergency landing protocols. Sir, we can't land either. They've got us suspended approximately 50 feet above ground level. We're trapped in mid-air by a network of pink birds acting like biological anchor cables. Jake looked at Napoleon, who was preening his feathers with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. You know, Jake said to his feathered friend, I'm starting to think you guys had this planned all along. Napoleon fixed him with one dark eye and made a sound that Jake had learned to recognize over the years. It was the crow equivalent of, took you long enough to figure it out, genius. Above them, the first of the Valdorian ships was attempting an emergency landing, its hull covered so completely in birds that it looked like a flying Christmas tree made of feathers and fury. The sound of alien panic mixed with triumphant bird calls filled the night air, creating what Jake decided was the most beautiful symphony he'd ever heard. Earth's birds had done the impossible. They'd turned humanity's first contact with an advanced alien civilization into the galaxy's most embarrassing military defeat. And they'd done it with style, coordination, and just enough attitude to make sure the Valdorians would never forget the day they underestimated the locals. The surrender came at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, broadcast on every frequency the Valdorian could still access, which, considering their ships were now mobile bird sanctuaries, wasn't many. This is Ambassador Krex of the Valdorian Empire, the transmission began, and Jake had never heard someone sound so thoroughly defeated. We hereby formally withdraw our territorial claims on the third planet of this system. Jake pumped his fist in the air while Napoleon performed what could only be described as a victory dance on his shoulder, complete with wing flaps and what sounded suspiciously like crow laughter. But Krex wasn't finished. Oh no, the ambassador was just getting started on what would become known throughout the galaxy as the most humiliating retreat speech in recorded history. Furthermore, we are issuing an immediate galactic warning to all Valdorian ships and allied forces. The third planet, designated locally as Earth, is to be classified as a nightmare world of the highest order. Under no circumstances should any vessel approach within 50 light-years of this cursed system. Sir, Commander Vex's voice interrupted, still barely audible over the sounds of what Jake was pretty sure were penguins tap-dancing on metal hull plating. Shouldn't we explain the nature of the threat to other potential visitors? Explain? Krex' voice cracked. How do we explain that we, the apex predators of 47 worlds, were defeated by creatures that weigh less than our breakfast? How do we report that our technologically superior fleet was neutralized by flying rats and oversized ducks? Please find I prefer to be called waterfowl, sir. I don't care what they prefer to be called. Jake decided he'd never enjoyed a conversation more. He pulled out his phone and started recording, partly for posterity and partly because he was pretty sure this would go viral in the best possible way. The broadcast continued. All vessels are advised that Earth's indigenous aerial life forms have demonstrated tactical coordination that exceeds our current understanding of primitive species behavior. They appear to possess a planet-wide communication network, advanced problem-solving capabilities, and what can only be described as a collective sense of humor about our suffering. The penguins are definitely mocking us, sir, Vex confirmed. They've learned to mimic our distress signals, but they're doing it in what sounds like sarcastic tones. Of course they are, Krex moaned. Because apparently, being defeated by flying creatures wasn't humiliating enough. They had to be smart, coordinated flying creatures with personality disorders. Jake looked up at the sky, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to show. The bird formations were still visible, but they seemed more relaxed now. More like victory laps than attack patterns. Occasionally, a group would break formation to perform what looked suspiciously like aerial acrobatics, as if celebrating. The Valdorian flagship, or what was left of it that wasn't covered in birds, was slowly limping toward the upper atmosphere. Through his intercepted communications, Jake could hear the continuing damage reports. Sir, the Ravens have figured out how to operate our beverage dispensers. They're apparently teaching the crows. And the pigeons have redecorated the officers' quarters. Extensively. Also, sir, one of the Canadian geese appears to have claimed the captain's chair as its personal territory. It won't let anyone approach, and it's making increasingly aggressive honking sounds at anyone who tries. Just get us out of here, Krex whispered. Full retreat to the outer system. We'll figure out how to explain this to High Command later. Actually, sir, about that. The communications log from this encounter has been automatically transmitted to Valdorian Central Command as per standard protocol. They're requesting clarification on several points. Such as? Well, sir, they want to know how we managed to lose to what our own sensors classified as small decorative fauna with limited cognitive capacity. Also, they're asking why our final transmission included the phrase, "the ducks are judging us," repeated 17 times. Jake burst out laughing. Napoleon looked at him with what he could have sworn was pride, then launched into the air to rejoin a passing formation of crows that seemed to be heading home after a job well done. By the time the sun was fully up, the last of the Valdorian ships had disappeared into the deep black of space, leaving behind only scattered feathers and what would become the most legendary victory in Earth's history. Jake's phone had been ringing non-stop for hours, as news outlets around the world tried to understand how a bird researcher from a remote mountain station had somehow orchestrated humanity's salvation. The first news crew arrived at 10 a.m., followed by what seemed like half the scientific community and 3 separate government agencies that Jake was pretty sure weren't supposed to exist. Dr. Emily Watson, his formerly skeptical station director, showed up around noon with a look of stunned disbelief and what might have been the beginning of an apology. "Jake," she said, staring at the clearing where he'd made his desperate call to the birds, "I owe you the biggest apology in the history of science. And possibly a raise. A very, very big raise." "Thanks, Emily," Jake replied, watching as a group of reporters tried to interview a particularly photogenic cardinal that seemed to be enjoying the attention. "But honestly, I didn't do much. I just asked for help. The birds did all the work." "You asked for help and they gave it. Do you realize what this means? You've documented the first case of interspecies military cooperation in recorded history. You've proven that Earth's wildlife possesses intelligence and organizational capabilities that we never even suspected. You've essentially rewritten everything we know about animal behavior, communication, and planetary defense systems." Jake nodded thoughtfully. It was all true, and it was all completely insane. 3 days ago, he'd been the weird guy who chirped at pigeons. Now he was being hailed as humanity's savior and the galaxy's first xenobiological diplomat. "So what happens now?" Emily asked. Jake looked up at the sky where a familiar black shape was circling overhead. Napoleon landed on his usual perch on Jake's shoulder and made a series of calls that Jake had come to recognize as status report. "Well," Jake said, reaching up to scratch Napoleon's neck, "I guess I should probably write this up properly. Journal of Interspecies Communication is going to want a full report. And I should probably figure out how to say thank you in about 3,000 different bird languages." "The government wants to offer you a position," Emily said, Department of Xenobiological Affairs. Apparently that's a thing now. Salary's classified, but they mention it involves a lot of zeros. Tempting, Jake admitted, but I think I'll stick with the research station. After all, somebody needs to keep an eye on our new planetary defense system. Make sure they're happy, well-fed, and ready in case any other apex predators decide to drop by. Napoleon let out what Jake had learned to recognize as approval, then took flight to join a mixed formation of crows, hawks, and what appeared to be a particularly militant group of blue jays. As Jake watched them go, he reflected on the strangest week of his life. Humanity had made first contact, faced extinction, and been saved by an army of birds that apparently had been waiting for someone to simply ask them nicely for help. It was ridiculous, impossible, and absolutely perfect. His phone buzzed with another interview request. This one was from the BBC, asking if he'd be willing to discuss the day the sky went dark, how one man's conversation with birds saved the world. Jake looked at the message, then up at the clearing sky where Earth's aerial defenders were returning to their normal routines of hunting, nesting, and generally going about their business as if they hadn't just handed the galaxy's most feared predators the most embarrassing defeat in military history. "You know what?" he said to no one in particular. "I think I'm going to enjoy being the guy who talks to birds." Above him, a lone crow called out what sounded remarkably like laughter, and Jake Morrison, humanity's first avian ambassador, smiled and called back in perfect crow vernacular, "You're welcome." The crow's response, roughly translated, was, "Next time, ask sooner, genius." Some things, Jake reflected, never changed. Birds would always have the last word.